Let's try to imagine something. The year is 550 AD. Europe is a continent in flux, a world that no longer resembles the one once ruled by the Roman Empire. And in this changing world, something strange is about to happen, something that would puzzle historians for centuries. On paper, Europe at this time is still a mosaic of familiar peoples. The Goths, scattered across the continent after the Great Migrations, various groups arriving from the Eurasian steppes, and ancient populations who had called the Balkans home for centuries. It's a crowded and complex map, but if we jump forward just one century to around 650 AD and reopen the historical records, we notice something odd. Many of those names have simply vanished, gone. It's as if a massive change swept through, but no one bothered to tell us how. The chronicles penned by monks or Byzantine officials stop mentioning the Goths. They no longer speak of the Sarmatians or the Illyrians. They all fade from the narrative. Instead, the texts begin to talk more and more insistently about another group, the Slavs. And these Slavs seem to appear out of nowhere and everywhere. Suddenly, we find them in the Balkans, in Central Europe, and across the vast eastern plains. Of course, in real history, no one appears out of thin air. Peoples don't just materialize. So the real question is, what actually happened? When we turn to archaeology for answers, the situation gets even stranger. We find tombs, pottery, and weapons that describe in detail the lives of Celts, Germans, and Romans. But for the Slavs, before the 6th century, archaeological traces are extremely rare, almost non-existent. A strange absence. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened. It simply means there's a chapter of history written, so to speak, with invisible ink. Even the ancient Roman authors, who were usually very curious and detailed in their descriptions of foreign peoples, are almost silent about the slaves. The first mentions are late, brief, and vague, like notes scribbled in the margins. This doesn't mean the Slavs didn't exist, it just means they weren't yet a major political force, so nobody bothered to write much about them. There's another field that helps us: linguistics. Studies show that the Slavic languages, Polish, Russian, Serbian, and others, begin to significantly diverge around 500 to 600 AD. Before that, there must have been a strong linguistic unity. A person speaking early Slavic, in what is now Poland, could probably communicate with someone in modern-day Ukraine without much trouble. This is a precious clue, because it matches exactly the moment when historical sources start mentioning them. It's as if the Slavs were becoming a visible cultural phenomenon, and their language began to split right at that time. When you have limited data and many questions, historians debate. Some believe the Slavs had always been there, perhaps hidden in the swamps of the Pripyat marshes. Hard to identify because they built no large cities and had no state-level organization. Others imagined a sudden, explosive expansion that pushed the Slavs to conquer half of Europe in a very short time. The problem was that for decades, no definitive proof existed to support either theory. A new tool was needed, and eventually that tool arrived: genetics, with the analysis of ancient DNA. At first, researchers focused on a genetic marker called R1a, which is very common among modern Slavic populations. It looked promising until they discovered that R1a was also widespread from India to Scandinavia. It was too old, too general, too widespread, like trying to find a specific book in a huge library using only the color of its cover. The real breakthrough came when geneticists started studying subclades, the smaller, more recent branches of that genetic tree. Two in particular, often referred to as Z280 and M458, turned out to be strongly linked to Slavic populations. These were much more precise. By studying their distribution through time and space, we finally began to understand where and when Slavic identity started to become recognizable. Take Poland, for example. Before 500 AD, archaeology shows a material culture associated with Germanic groups like the Goths. After 500, that culture disappears, replaced by a new one, the one we associate with early Slavs. So, did the Slavs arrive and push out the Germans? The DNA says no. The population is basically the same. There was no mass invasion, no population replacement. What we see is a cultural transformation. The people stayed, but they changed their language, their customs, and their style of pottery. We see the same pattern in the Ukrainian steppes. Scythians lived there for centuries. Then the Slavs appear. But the Scythians didn't vanish. Their genetic heritage flows into modern Ukrainians. What changed was the culture, the language, the identity. In the Balkans, this continuity is even more striking. Illyrians, Thracians, Dacians, ancient populations that had been Romanized for centuries, were not replaced. Their DNA is a fundamental component of today's Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians. They simply adopted a new Slavic identity over time, perhaps because in that historical context, Slavic culture was more adaptable, flexible, and advantageous. When we widen our view to all of Central and Eastern Europe, the pattern repeats like clockwork. Czechs, Slovaks, Belarusians, Russians, each people carries a different local genetic substrate. Some Celtic, some Germanic, some Baltic, some Finno-Ugric, but they all eventually adopt a Slavic language and culture. It was a cultural phenomenon, not primarily a demographic one. So why did it happen? Because in that moment of crisis and transition after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Slavic culture had particular strengths. A relatively easy-to-learn language, a flexible social structure based on small communities, and religious beliefs that could blend easily with local traditions. In a chaotic time, it was a model that worked and it spread. Centuries later, with the rise of modern nationalism in the 19th century, this complex history was simplified. Every nation sought a pure origin story, a straight line from their past to their present, but reality was far more shaded and messy. Slavic identity didn't emerge from a single people expanding outward. It was the result of a slow process of contact, marriage, trade, and adaptation. A mosaic, not a straight line on a map. And the most fascinating part is this. In many regions, the populations didn't change. Their genes stayed. What changed was their culture, how they spoke, how they lived, and how they understood themselves. Identities are not eternal. They are not written in stone or in blood. They evolve, mix, and transform. And when they do, they leave behind traces that we can still read today, if we know where to look. And thanks to fields like genetics, we now have more tools than ever to uncover those traces. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.